Marcus Wellington had mastered the art of control. At 52 years old, he commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, his signature appearing on contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His tailored suits cost more than most people earned in a month, and his penthouse overlooked the city like a throne room surveying a kingdom. Yet every Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, this titan of industry found himself in the same modest cafe on Riverside Avenue, sitting across from the one person who rendered all his power utterly meaningless. His daughter, Emma, sat with perfect posture in the chair opposite him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. At 7 years old, she possessed her late mother's delicate features and striking green eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds Marcus could never access. She wore a navy blue dress with white trim, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail secured with a ribbon that matched her outfit perfectly. Everything about her appearance spoke of care and attention to detail. Yet Marcus knew these were the efforts of Maria, the nanny, not his own. The cafe itself was unremarkable, a neighborhood establishment that served decent coffee and better pastries. Marcus had chosen it precisely because it was ordinary, a place where he could briefly step away from the overwhelming grandeur of his usual life. The walls were painted a warm cream color, adorned with local artwork that rotated monthly. Small round tables dotted the floor, and the air always carried the comforting aroma of fresh-baked goods and roasted coffee beans. A chalkboard menu hung behind the counter, listing the day's specials in colorful handwriting that changed with whoever was working that shift. Marcus ordered his usual black coffee and a croissant, then pointed to the display case of pastries when the server approached their table. He gestured vaguely toward Emma, assuming the young woman would understand his daughter needed something sweet. This was how it always went. He provided, she received, and somewhere in that transaction, he convinced himself he was being a good father. Emma's eyes had lit up at the sight of the pastries, and she pointed eagerly at a chocolate muffin topped with what appeared to be chocolate chips. Marcus nodded at the server, a young woman he'd seen here before but never really noticed, and she disappeared to fetch their order. He pulled out his phone, already checking emails before their breakfast had even arrived. A hostile takeover bid needed his attention. The quarterly reports from his Singapore office required review. The digital world beckoned with its endless demands, and he answered willingly, grateful for the distraction from the uncomfortable silence that always settled between him and his daughter. Emma watched her father, her small face revealing nothing. She had learned long ago that trying to gain his attention was futile when the phone appeared. Instead, she looked around the cafe with interest, observing the other patrons. An elderly couple sat by the window, sharing a newspaper and occasionally reading passages aloud to each other, their comfortable intimacy built over decades. A young mother struggled with a toddler in a high chair while balancing a coffee cup and attempting to eat a bagel, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and overwhelming love. A group of college students clustered around a larger table, their laptops open, but their conversation animated as they debated something with passionate gestures and laughter. These people fascinated Emma. She studied the way they communicated, the ease with which words flowed between them like a river she could see but never touch. She had stopped trying to speak years ago, after countless therapy sessions, and her father's increasing frustration had made it clear that her silence was somehow a failure, a deficiency that disappointed him. The doctors had explained to Marcus that Emma's mutism was selective, likely triggered by the trauma of losing her mother in childbirth and compounded by his emotional absence. They said she could speak, physically, but something psychological prevented it. Marcus had thrown money at the problem, hiring the best specialists, enrolling her in exclusive programs, but nothing changed. Eventually, he'd simply accepted it as another challenge he couldn't overcome with wealth or willpower. The server returned with their order, setting down Marcus's coffee and croissant with practiced efficiency. But when she placed Emma's chocolate muffin on the table, something unexpected happened. The young woman's hands moved in fluid, graceful gestures as she looked directly at Emma. Her fingers spelled out shapes and meanings, and suddenly, Emma's entire face transformed. The careful mask of neutral observation shattered, replaced by pure, undiluted joy. Marcus looked up from his phone, startled by the change in his daughter's expression. He watched, confused, as Emma's own small hands began to move in response, hesitant at first, then, with increasing confidence. The server smiled warmly, nodding encouragement as they engaged in this silent conversation that Marcus couldn't understand. He felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Was it jealousy that this stranger could elicit such happiness from his daughter when he never could? Was it shame that he was witnessing a connection he'd never bothered to create? Or was it simply the stark realization of his own failure as a father? The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though to Marcus it felt simultaneously like an eternity and an instant. When the server finally turned to leave, Emma grabbed her hand, her eyes pleading for her to stay. The young woman glanced at Marcus, clearly uncertain about remaining at their table when other customers needed attention. He found himself nodding permission, surprising himself with the gesture. She pulled over a chair from a nearby empty table and sat down, introducing herself to Emma with more of those mysterious hand movements. Marcus sat frozen, his coffee growing cold in his hand, as he watched his daughter come alive. Emma's hands moved faster now, telling stories or asking questions he couldn't decipher. Her face glowed with animation, her eyes sparkling with an intelligence and personality he'd glimpsed only in rare moments. She laughed, an actual sound that startled him because he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard it. The server laughed too, responding to whatever Emma had communicated, and the two of them seemed to inhabit a world of their own making, one where Marcus was merely a spectator. The cafe continued its morning rhythm around them. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled. Conversations buzzed at other tables. Someone's phone rang with an intrusive jingle. But, at their small table, something profound was happening. Marcus was seeing his daughter, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time since her mother had died bringing her into the world. He was seeing her not as the silent, broken thing he'd mentally labeled her, not as the daughter who would never live up to the son he'd wanted, but as a complete person with thoughts, feelings, and a desperate need to be understood. The server's name tag read Keisha, and now that Marcus was actually paying attention, he noticed details he'd missed in his previous visits. She was probably in her mid-20s, with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the cafe's standard uniform of black pants and a green apron over a white shirt. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance, yet she possessed something Marcus didn't, something he'd never thought to acquire despite all his resources and power. She had the ability to reach his daughter. When Keisha finally had to excuse herself to attend to other customers, Emma's face fell so dramatically that Marcus felt it like a physical blow. His daughter turned to him, and, for the first time in recent memory, she looked at him with what he could only describe as accusation. Her hands moved in those same gestures she'd used with Keisha, but faster, more urgently, almost desperately. She was trying to communicate with him, trying to bridge the chasm between them, but he had no idea what she was saying. He had never felt more powerless in his entire life. Marcus had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding what they wanted before they said it, on anticipating market movements, and negotiating deals that left everyone feeling they'd won even when he'd secured every advantage. But here, faced with his own 7-year-old daughter, he was completely illiterate. He couldn't read her language. He'd never even tried to learn it. The realization crashed over him like a wave, leaving him breathless with shame. Emma's hands slowed, then stopped. The light faded from her eyes as resignation settled over her features once more. She picked at her chocolate muffin, no longer eating with the enthusiasm she'd shown moments before. The silence between them returned, but now it felt different to Marcus. Before, it had been simply the absence of sound, an unfortunate circumstance he'd learned to tolerate. Now it felt like a wall, one he'd built himself brick by brick through years of negligence and willful ignorance. He wanted to say something, to somehow explain or apologize or promise to do better, but the words caught in his throat. What right did he have to make promises when he'd broken so many already, even if they'd been unspoken? What could he possibly say that would matter when he couldn't even understand her response? For the first time in decades, Marcus Wellington was at a complete loss. Keisha returned to refill his coffee, and Marcus found himself doing something entirely out of character. He spoke to her, actually engaged her in conversation rather than simply placing orders or offering perfunctory thanks. His voice came out rougher than intended, emotion making it crack slightly. "That thing you did," he said, gesturing vaguely at his hands. "The hand movements. That's sign language." Keisha looked surprised by the question, glancing between Marcus and Emma before nodding. "Yes, sir. American Sign Language. Your daughter is quite fluent in it, actually. She's been telling me about her favorite books and how she wants a dog someday, maybe a golden retriever." Marcus stared at his daughter. She wants a dog. This basic fact about his own child was news to him. He'd never asked, never created any avenue for her to tell him. The enormity of his failure expanded, threatening to suffocate him. "How long have you been signing with her?" he asked, his business mind trying to establish a timeline to understand the parameters of this situation. "This is the first time," Keisha replied gently. "I noticed you two came in regularly, and I've seen Emma trying to sign a few times before, little things like please and thank you. I learned ASL in college, originally for a linguistics course, but I kept studying it because it fascinated me. I never imagined I'd use it in a cafe. First time. This connection, this transformation in his daughter, had happened in minutes with a complete stranger. Years of expensive therapists, specialized schools, and carefully controlled environments had never produced anything close to the joy he'd witnessed in Emma's face today. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. "Does she?" Marcus paused, struggling to ask the question. "Does she seem happy to you? When she's signing, I mean?" Keisha's expression softened with something that looked like pity, and Marcus hated it, even as he recognized he deserved it. "She seems like herself," Keisha said carefully. "She seems like a bright, curious, wonderful little girl who has a lot to say. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, do you know sign language?" The question was asked kindly, without judgment, but Marcus felt judged nonetheless. He shook his head, unable to meet Keisha's eyes or his daughter's. "No, I don't. I never learned." The words hung in the air, an admission of guilt that felt like a confession. Emma had returned to picking at her muffin, her shoulders slightly hunched, her whole body language screaming defeat and resignation. She'd given up on him, Marcus realized. His 7-year-old daughter had already written him off as someone who would never truly see her, never truly know her. She'd accepted their relationship as transactional, providing what little warmth she could offer and taking what material comfort he provided in return, but expecting nothing deeper. A business arrangement between father and daughter. Something broke inside Marcus in that moment. He'd survived his own father's emotional abuse, his mother's abandonment, the cutthroat world of high finance, and the devastating loss of his wife. He'd weathered hostile takeovers, economic crashes, and public scandals. But this, sitting across from his own child, and realizing he'd become the very thing he'd sworn never to be, a parent who failed to truly see their child. This was the breaking point. "Could you teach me?" The words came out before Marcus had fully formed the thought. Both Keisha and Emma looked at him in surprise. "Sign language, I mean. Could you teach me to talk to my daughter?" Keisha's face registered shock, then something like hope. She glanced at Emma, whose expression had transformed from resignation to cautious disbelief. "Sir, I'm not a certified ASL instructor. I mean, I'm fluent, but there are professional teachers who—" "I don't want professional teachers," Marcus interrupted, his business persona asserting itself even as he tried to communicate something more vulnerable. "I've hired professionals for everything else, and none of it worked because I never actually engaged with the problem. I need someone who can help me understand my daughter, not someone who will teach me grammatical structures and vocabulary lists in isolation." He looked at Emma, really looked at her, trying to communicate through eye contact what he couldn't yet say with his hands. "I've been a terrible father. I've been absent and distant, and I've treated your silence like a problem to be solved instead of a language to be learned. I can't undo the past 7 years, but I can try to do better starting now. If you'll let me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus felt his own vision blur. When had he last cried? At Catherine's funeral? Before that? He couldn't remember. Emma's small hands moved slowly, and he wished desperately that he could understand what she was saying. Was she accepting his apology? Was she telling him it was too late? Was she expressing hope or skepticism, or simply acknowledging his words? Keisha watched the exchange with glistening eyes of her own. I have breaks, she said quietly. I work Tuesday through Saturday, and I get a 30-minute break around 10:30 each day. If you wanted to come during that time, I could spend my break teaching you. It wouldn't be comprehensive, and you'd need to practice on your own, but I could get you started. Marcus nodded immediately, already mentally rearranging his schedule, canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities. For years, he'd claimed his work was too important to step away from, that the empire would crumble without his constant attention. But, looking at his daughter's tear-stained face, he understood with sudden clarity that he'd had his priorities catastrophically wrong. The empire could survive without him. Emma might not. Every day, he said firmly. I'll be here every day during your break, for as long as it takes. And Emma will come with me, so she can help teach me too, if she wants to. Keisha smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that made her entire face light up. That would be wonderful. Emma, would you like to help teach your dad sign language? Emma nodded so vigorously that her ponytail bounced. Her hands moved rapidly, and Keisha laughed, translating for Marcus. She says yes. And she promises to be patient with you even when you mess up, which she says will be a lot. Despite everything, Marcus found himself laughing too, a rusty sound that felt foreign after so many years of corporate seriousness. She's probably right. I'm used to being the smartest person in the room. This will be a humbling experience. Emma's hands moved again, slower this time, and she looked at Keisha expectantly. The young woman's expression turned gentle. She says you don't have to be the smartest. You just have to try. That's all she wants. The following morning, Marcus woke at 5:30 as usual, but instead of immediately checking market reports from overseas, he found himself sitting on his bed with his laptop open to American Sign Language tutorial videos. His fingers felt clumsy and oversized as he attempted to mirror the shapes on the screen, forming letters that looked nothing like the fluid movements he'd watched Keisha execute. The alphabet alone seemed impossible. 26 letters, each with its own specific configuration, and he kept mixing up M and N, confusing S and A. His hands, which could sign multi-million-dollar contracts without trembling, shook with frustration as he practiced. Maria, the nanny, knocked on his door at 7 to confirm Emma's breakfast preferences, a routine task she'd handled independently for years. When Marcus opened the door, still in his pajamas rather than his usual morning suit, she looked startled. Is everything all right, Mr. Wellington? She asked in her soft Spanish accent, genuine concern coloring her voice. I need you to do something for me, Marcus said without preamble. I need you to find out if Emma knows I'm trying to learn sign language. Don't tell her directly, but if she asks about my schedule today, tell her I'll be at the cafe again, with her, and that I'm serious about this. Maria's eyes widened slightly. In the 5 years she'd worked for the Wellington family, she'd never seen Marcus show this kind of investment in his daughter's life. Of course, sir. And, if I may say, this is a very good thing you're doing. Marcus nodded, already turning back to his laptop. He had 3 hours before they needed to leave for the cafe, and he intended to use every minute. He ordered breakfast to be brought to his room, something he'd never done before, too focused on forming hand shapes to bother with the dining room ritual. Toast went cold on the plate as he practiced fingerspelling his name, Emma's name, simple words like hello and good morning and I love you. That last one made him pause. When had he last said those words to his daughter? When had he last said them to anyone? The sign for love was simple, elegant even. Cross your arms over your chest, hands in fists. Such a small gesture to convey such a massive emotion. Marcus practiced it over and over, wanting to be absolutely certain he could execute it perfectly when the time came to use it. Emma appeared in his doorway around 8:30, already dressed in a yellow sundress with small white flowers embroidered along the hem. She watched him for a long moment, her head tilted in that observant way she had, and Marcus felt suddenly self-conscious about his attempts. His hands froze mid-sign, awkwardly positioned in a shape that probably meant nothing or, worse, something embarrassing. Then, Emma stepped into the room, approached his desk, and gently adjusted his hand position. Her small fingers moved his thumb, corrected the angle of his wrist, and, when she stepped back, he found himself forming a proper letter F. She nodded approvingly, and a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Marcus felt an absurd rush of pride at this tiny accomplishment, more satisfaction than he'd felt closing his last billion-dollar deal. They practiced together for the remaining half hour before they needed to leave, Emma patiently correcting his mistakes, showing him how to transition between letters, helping him spell simple words. She was a natural teacher, Marcus realized, patient but insistent on accuracy. She wouldn't let him move on to a new letter until he'd mastered the previous one, a discipline he recognized from his own business methodology. Like father, like daughter, he thought with a mixture of pride and pain for all the years they'd lost. The drive to the cafe felt different than their previous Tuesday mornings. Usually, Marcus would make calls during the 20-minute trip while Emma stared out the window in silence. Today, he left his phone in his pocket and tried, awkwardly, to sign simple things to her. "Good morning" came out wrong, his fingers fumbling, and Emma giggled. Actually giggled. The sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that Marcus nearly pulled over just to savor it. When they arrived at the cafe, Keisha was already waiting near their usual table, her break apparently timed to their arrival. She smiled warmly as they approached, signing a greeting to Emma that Marcus couldn't follow yet, though he caught his daughter's delighted response. The ease between them made something twist in his chest again, but he pushed down the jealousy. This wasn't about his ego. This was about Emma. "Good morning," Keisha said aloud, then signed something to Marcus slowly, pointing to her hands. He recognized it as the sign for morning and attempted to copy her movement. She nodded encouragingly, though he suspected his execution was poor. They sat down, and Keisha pulled out a small notebook from her apron pocket. "I thought we could start with basics today. Greetings, common words, things you'd use in daily conversation with Emma. Does that work?" Marcus nodded, pulling out his own leather-bound notebook, the one he usually used for meeting notes. Today it would serve a different purpose. "I've been practicing the alphabet," he said, feeling oddly like a student reporting to a teacher. "I'm not very good yet, but I can get through it without too many mistakes." Emma's hands moved, and Keisha translated. "She says you got F wrong 3 times this morning, but you're improving." Marcus looked at his daughter, eyebrows raised. She'd been counting his mistakes? Emma grinned, clearly pleased with herself, and signed something else that made Keisha laugh. "What did she say?" Marcus asked, feeling the familiar frustration of being excluded from the conversation. "She said you make funny faces when you mess up, like you're personally offended by your own fingers." Keisha's tone was gentle, making it clear Emma was teasing, not mocking. Marcus felt his face heat with embarrassment, but then he caught Emma's expression. She was happy, genuinely happy, engaging with him in a way she never had before. If being the butt of gentle jokes was the price of admission to her world, he'd pay it gladly. "All right," he said, positioning his hands. "Teach me." For the next 30 minutes, Keisha walked him through fundamental signs. Family members: mother, father, daughter, sister, brother. Basic verbs: eat, drink, sleep, want, need. Emotions: happy, sad, angry, scared, excited. Marcus's hands cramped from the unfamiliar positions, and he had to stop several times to shake them out, but he persisted. Emma watched the entire lesson with rapt attention, occasionally correcting his form or demonstrating a sign when he struggled. The most challenging part wasn't the individual signs, but the grammar, which Keisha explained worked differently than spoken English. Questions required specific facial expressions. Word order changed. There was no direct translation for many concepts. Marcus, who prided himself on his linguistic abilities, having learned passable Mandarin and fluent Japanese for business purposes, found himself utterly humbled by ASL. "It's not just about the hands," Keisha explained when Marcus expressed frustration. "Sign language is 3-dimensional. Your facial expressions, body language, the space around you, all of it conveys meaning. Think of it like this. In spoken English, you use tone of voice to convey emotion or emphasis, right? In ASL, you use your whole body. To demonstrate, she signed the word angry with a neutral expression, then signed it again with an angry face, her movements sharper, more aggressive. The difference was startling. The same hand movements carried completely different weights depending on the emotional context. Marcus tried it himself, signing happy with an exaggerated smile, and Emma burst out laughing. Apparently, his execution was either perfect comedy or perfectly comedic. He wasn't sure which. But Emma was laughing, and that was enough. When Keisha's break ended, she promised to see them the next day and encouraged Marcus to practice. As she walked away, Emma pulled out a small notepad from her bag, something Maria must have given her, and wrote in careful letters, "You did good, Daddy." Daddy. She'd written Daddy, not Father. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he read the words. When had she stopped calling him that aloud, before the silence had claimed her voice? He couldn't remember, but here it was, written in her careful handwriting, an olive branch extended across years of distance. He pulled out his phone, not to check emails this time, but to set a reminder. Practice ASL, 1 hour daily. Then, he added another reminder. Ask Emma about her day. And another, tell Emma I love her. These things shouldn't need reminders, he knew that, but after years of neglect, he needed the structure, the accountability. He'd built his business empire through discipline and routine. Surely he could apply the same principles to rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. They ordered lunch, and Marcus attempted to use signs for his food requests. His execution was terrible, mixing up the signs for sandwich and soup. But the waitress, an older woman named Dorothy who'd worked at the cafe for 20 years, seemed charmed by the attempt. Emma helped him, correcting his hand positions, and they created their own small moment of connection over something as mundane as ordering food. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus's entire life restructured itself around learning ASL. He hired a private instructor to come to his office 3 times a week during lunch, supplementing Keisha's morning lessons. He watched ASL videos during his commute. He practiced with Emma every evening, sitting with her in her playroom, an area of his massive penthouse he'd rarely visited before, attempting to discuss her day, her toys, her thoughts. The conversations were stilted and basic, limited by his elementary vocabulary, but they were conversations nonetheless. His business associates noticed the change. Marcus Wellington, notorious for never missing a meeting, for being available at all hours, for treating every business interaction as a top priority, started declining appointments. He left the office at 5 every day, unheard of in his industry. When questioned, he simply stated he had family obligations, offering no further explanation. The rumor mill churned with speculation about illness or scandal, but Marcus didn't care. For the first time in his adult life, he'd found something more important than his business reputation. Emma blossomed under the attention. The quiet, withdrawn child who'd moved through the penthouse like a ghost began to emerge as a vibrant, opinionated, surprisingly funny little girl. She had thoughts about everything, Marcus discovered. Strong opinions about which books were good and which were boring. Preferences in food that went beyond simple likes and dislikes. She could explain, in sign, that she preferred strawberries to raspberries because they were sweeter, but she liked raspberry jam better than strawberry jam because it had more flavor. She wanted to learn piano, to visit the ocean, to have a tree house even though they lived in a penthouse. She dreamed of being a veterinarian, specifically for birds, because she thought they were the most beautiful creatures. Marcus learned all of this not through hired intermediaries or secondhand reports, but through direct communication with his daughter. Each new revelation felt like unwrapping a precious gift, a piece of her interior world that she was choosing to share with him. He wrote everything down in his notebook, the same leather-bound book he'd brought to that first lesson with Keisha, which was now filled with vocabulary lists, grammar notes, and observations about Emma's personality. The Tuesday morning cafe visits became sacred. No matter what was happening in his business empire, Marcus was at that cafe at 9 o'clock with Emma by his side. They'd order breakfast, and when Keisha's break came, the 3 of them would sit together, Keisha teaching, Emma helping, Marcus learning. Other cafe regulars began to recognize them, smiling at the unusual sight of the well-dressed businessman whose hands moved through increasingly complex signs as he conversed with his daughter, and the kind waitress who'd brought them together. One Tuesday, about a month into his lessons, Emma showed Marcus a book she'd brought from home. It was a children's story about a deaf girl who taught her hearing family sign language so they could all communicate. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he realized Emma had been reading this book for years, perhaps hoping, dreaming that someday it might be her story too. "Read it with me," he signed, his movements still slow and deliberate, but much more confident than his first attempts. Emma's face lit up, and she nodded enthusiastically. They spent Keisha's entire break reading together, Emma signing the story, Marcus following along with the written words, and trying to understand her signs. When he missed something, Keisha would translate, but, increasingly, he could follow Emma's narrative on his own. The story was simple, meant for young children, but, to Marcus, it was profound. It was about a family learning to understand each other, about bridges being built across silence, about love expressed in new languages. When they finished, Emma signed something to him that Keisha had taught him weeks ago, but he'd been too afraid to use, worried his execution wouldn't convey the depth of feeling he wanted to express. "I love you, Daddy." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. In front of Keisha, in front of the cafe full of people, he signed back, "I love you too, Emma. I'm sorry I took so long to learn to tell you." Emma launched herself across the table into his arms, nearly knocking over his coffee, and Marcus held her tight. This precious child he'd almost lost to his own negligence and pride. Over Emma's shoulder, he saw Keisha wiping her own eyes, and he mouthed a silent "thank you" to the young woman who'd seen what he'd been blind to. That evening, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He canceled the rest of his week's appointments, delegated his responsibilities to his executive team, and told Maria to take the week off with full pay. Then, he sat down with Emma and signed. "What do you want to do?" "Just you and me. Anything." Emma's eyes went wide with surprise and possibilities. Her hands moved quickly, excitedly, and Marcus had to ask her to slow down twice before he could fully understand. The zoo. She wanted to go to the zoo, then to a bookstore to pick out new books, then to a park where she'd seen other children flying kites. She wanted to get ice cream, the really fancy kind with mix-ins. She wanted to visit a pet store and look at the animals, even though they weren't ready for a dog yet. She wanted to do all the normal things that normal fathers and daughters did together, the experiences he'd been too busy to provide. "Yes," Marcus signed, then fingerspelled it for emphasis. "Yes to all of it. We'll do everything." They spent the week together, just the two of them, navigating a city Marcus had lived in for decades but never really explored. He'd been to countless high-end restaurants, exclusive clubs, important buildings, but he'd never been to the zoo, never browsed children's books in a bookstore, never flown a kite in a public park. Emma was his guide in this new world, showing him things he'd been too blind to see before. At the zoo, Emma's favorite exhibit was the aviary, where hundreds of birds flew freely in a massive enclosed habitat. She stood in the middle of the space, arms outstretched, face tilted up, as birds swooped and called overhead. Marcus watched her, understanding for the first time why she dreamed of being a veterinarian for birds. She saw freedom in their flight, grace in their movements. She identified with them, he realized. Like birds, she moved through the world in ways different from those around her, communicating in languages others didn't always understand, beautiful and complete exactly as she was. "They're amazing," Marcus signed when she looked at him, checking to make sure he was seeing what she saw. "Like you." Emma signed back, and the simplicity of the compliment, the pure love in her small hands forming those shapes, nearly broke him. In the bookstore, Emma selected 6 books, then looked at Marcus nervously, clearly expecting him to say it was too many. Instead, he signed, "More. Pick more. Fill your whole shelf." Her shock transformed into delight, and she ran through the store, selecting treasures until Marcus had to ask for a cart to carry them all. 23 books. Emma chose 23 books, ranging from picture books to early chapter books to one massive illustrated encyclopedia of birds that cost more than most people spent on textbooks. The young cashier, a college student with purple-streaked hair and multiple piercings, watched them with interest. "Wow, someone's going to be busy reading," she said cheerfully. "My daughter loves books," Marcus replied, pride evident in his voice. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he added, "We're going to read them together." She's teaching me sign language so we can talk about them. The cashier's expression softened. That's beautiful, she said, then turned to Emma and signed, "Happy reading." It was a simple phrase, but Emma's face showed her surprise and joy at being addressed directly in her language. Marcus made a mental note to himself. Emma encountered people who could sign too rarely. He needed to change that, needed to create more opportunities for her to exist in spaces where her language was understood and valued. They flew kites in the park, Emma's small purple butterfly kite soaring next to Marcus's larger dragon, their strings occasionally tangling before they corrected course. They got ice cream with so many mix-ins that the combinations were probably terrible, but Emma laughed as they tried them anyway. They visited a pet store, where Emma spent an hour signing conversations with the parrots, delighted that the birds mimicked some of her hand movements even if they didn't understand them. In the evenings, back at the penthouse, they'd read together from her new books, Emma signing the stories, Marcus following along, and practicing new vocabulary. She was patient with his mistakes, encouraging with his improvements, and firm when he tried to skip ahead without mastering a concept. She'd inherited his perfectionist streak, he realized, though she applied it with more grace and kindness than he'd ever managed. On Friday evening, their last night before Maria returned, and Marcus the following Tuesday morning arrived with an unexpected rain shower that turned the city streets slick and reflective. Marcus drove more carefully than usual, hyper-aware of Emma in the passenger seat, clutching the bag containing 3 of her new books that she wanted to share with Keisha. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm as they made their way to the cafe, and Marcus found himself thinking about gratitude, about debt, about the impossible task of thanking someone for giving you back something you'd lost without even realizing it was gone. How did you thank someone for showing you your own child? How did you compensate someone for an act of kindness that had cost them nothing but had given you everything? Marcus had spent his entire adult life quantifying value, assigning dollar amounts to services rendered, calculating return on investment. But this was different. This existed outside the transactional world, he understood. Keisha hadn't done this for money or advancement or recognition. She'd simply seen a child who needed to be understood and taken the time to speak her language. The cafe was more crowded than usual, people seeking shelter from the rain and nursing hot drinks while they waited for the weather to clear. Marcus and Emma managed to secure their usual table, and while they waited for Keisha to notice their arrival, Emma pulled out her books, arranging them carefully on the table's surface like precious artifacts in a museum display. Keisha appeared within minutes, her face lighting up when she saw them. She signed a greeting to Emma, who responded with enthusiastic hand movements that Marcus could now partially follow. Something about the rain, something about new books, something about missing Keisha. His daughter had missed their Tuesday morning lessons during the week they'd spent together. The realization made Marcus smile. He'd given Emma his undivided attention for 7 days, something he'd never done before, and yet she'd still thought about the kind waitress who'd been the catalyst for their transformation. "I'm not officially on break yet," Keisha said, glancing toward the counter where her manager was handling the morning rush. "But I can take your order and maybe steal a few minutes. What can I get you?" Marcus ordered his usual coffee, then paused, doing something he'd never done in all his months of visits to this cafe. "What would you recommend?" he asked. "Not coffee. Something you like. Something good." Keisha looked surprised by the question, then pleased. "The lavender honey latte," she said after a moment's consideration. "It's unconventional, but it's my favorite. And for Emma, may I suggest the hot chocolate? We just started adding homemade marshmallows, and they're incredible." "Perfect," Marcus said, then added, "And whatever you want for yourself. Please, I'd like to buy you a drink." "Oh, you don't need to," Keisha started, but Marcus interrupted gently. "I know I don't need to. I want to. It's the least I can do." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his meaning, because Keisha nodded slowly. "Thank you. I'll be right back with your drinks." While she was gone, Emma showed Marcus the books she'd brought, signing brief summaries of each one. He recognized them from their reading sessions over the past week. A story about a girl who could talk to animals, a mystery involving a missing necklace, and a clever detective. An illustrated guide to different types of clouds. Emma's interests were eclectic, ranging from fiction to nonfiction, fantasy to science, and Marcus loved discovering the breadth of her curiosity. Keisha returned with their drinks, and a third cup for herself, some kind of tea that smelled like cinnamon and apples. She sat down, officially starting her break, and Emma immediately launched into animated signing, showing Keisha her books, explaining which ones were her favorites, asking Keisha if she'd read any of them. Marcus sipped his lavender honey latte, surprised by how much he enjoyed the floral sweetness combined with the rich espresso. He'd been ordering black coffee for decades out of habit, never bothering to explore alternatives. Another small way he'd been stuck in rigid patterns, he supposed. Another area where a little openness could lead to better experiences. These are wonderful choices, Keisha signed, and spoke simultaneously for Marcus's benefit. I especially love this one. She pointed to the animal communication book. I read it when I was about your age. Emma's hands moved rapidly, asking questions about Keisha's childhood reading habits, and the two of them fell into an easy conversation that Marcus could now follow much better than he had a month ago. His comprehension wasn't perfect. He still missed words, still had to ask for clarification. But he could participate now, could add his own observations, could be part of the dialogue rather than a confused observer. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, Marcus set down his cup and looked at Keisha directly. I need to thank you, he said simply. Properly thank you. And I'm not entirely sure how. Keisha looked uncomfortable with the attention. You don't need to thank me, Mr. Wellington. Please call me Marcus. And yes, I do need to thank you. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find words adequate to the moment. A month ago, I was a stranger to my own daughter. I'd convinced myself that I was doing enough by providing for her materially, by hiring the best caregivers and therapists, by ensuring she had every advantage money could buy. But I wasn't actually there. I wasn't present. I didn't speak her language, literally or metaphorically. Emma had set down her books and was watching her father intently. Marcus continued, aware that he was speaking as much to his daughter as to Keisha. You saw what I'd been blind to. You took the time to communicate with Emma when I'd been too lazy, too self-centered, too wrapped up in my own world to bother learning how. You didn't judge me for my failure, but you also didn't let it continue. You offered to help, and that help has changed everything. Keisha's eyes were glistening, but she shook her head. I just use sign language. That's not. It's everything. Marcus interrupted quietly. It showed me that Emma wasn't the one with a problem that needed fixing. I was. And it gave me the tools to fix it, or at least to start fixing it. This past month has been the best month of my entire life, including my wedding day, including the day I made my first million, including every achievement I thought mattered. Because this past month, I've actually gotten to know my daughter. The real Emma, not the silent shadow I'd relegated her to in my mind. A tear rolled down Keisha's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. Emma reached across the table and took her hand, signing something that made Keisha laugh even as she cried. What did she say? Marcus asked, still learning, still needing translations. She said I'm not allowed to cry because it's a happy thing, and happy things should only have happy tears, and these look like sad tears, Keisha translated, her voice thick with emotion. They're happy tears, Keisha signed to Emma, exaggerating her smile to prove her point. I'm so glad you and your daddy are talking now. You deserve to be understood. Marcus pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket, something he'd prepared the night before after extensive consideration. I know you're a student, he said, addressing Keisha. Emma told me during one of our conversations. She said you mentioned taking classes. Keisha nodded, looking slightly wary at the direction of the conversation. I'm finishing my linguistics degree. Part-time, while working. It's slow going, but I'm getting there. How much longer do you have? Marcus asked. 2 years, probably. Maybe a little less if I can afford to take more classes per semester. Marcus slid the envelope across the table. This is a check for your remaining tuition, plus living expenses for the next 2 years. It's also a standing offer. If you want to work for me after graduation, I'd like to hire you to develop and run an accessibility program within my company. I've realized over the past month that my entire corporate structure is built around the assumption that everyone communicates the same way. That's not just wrong, it's discriminatory. I want to change that, and I want you to help me. Keisha stared at the envelope like it might explode. I can't accept this. This is too much. I just did something kind. People do kind things for each other. They don't deserve. You changed my daughter's life, Marcus said firmly. You changed my life. And I'm not offering this as payment for that kindness because I know that's impossible to quantify. I'm offering this because you're clearly passionate about linguistics and communication. You have a natural gift for teaching, and you saw a problem in the world, people being unable to understand each other, and you did something about it. That's exactly the kind of person I want working for me. Emma was watching this exchange with interest, her head swiveling between her father and Keisha like a spectator at a tennis match. Her hands moved, asking Keisha a question that Marcus didn't quite catch. Keisha signed back, then translated for Marcus. She asked if I'm going to say yes. I told her I don't know. This is a very big decision. You don't have to decide now, Marcus said. The tuition money is yours regardless. Consider it a scholarship if the idea of a gift makes you uncomfortable. As for the job, you have 2 years to think about it. But I meant what I said. I need people like you in my organization. People who see what others miss. People who take the time to communicate instead of just talking. Keisha opened the envelope with shaking hands, then gasped when she saw the check amount. Marcus, this is 4 times what my tuition costs. The extra is for living expenses, Marcus explained. So you can focus on school without working full-time. You can keep your job here if you want. I know you enjoy it, but you won't need to for financial reasons. Tears were flowing freely down Keisha's face now, and Emma handed her a napkin, signing something with her other hand. Keisha laughed through her tears and nodded. What did she say this time? Marcus asked, smiling. She said these look like proper happy tears now, and they're allowed. Keisha translated. Oh my God, Marcus, I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Then, we're even, Marcus replied. Because thank you doesn't seem like enough for what you've given me either. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of gratitude and generosity settling over the table like a warm blanket. Around them, the cafe bustled with its usual morning energy, but their small corner felt separate, protected, sacred. Emma broke the silence by pulling out her bird encyclopedia, the massive illustrated tome she'd been so excited about. She opened it to a section on tropical birds, their plumage brilliant even in printed photographs, and began signing to Keisha about her dream of becoming an avian veterinarian. Keisha engaged fully, asking questions about specific species, sharing her own knowledge about bird behavior and communication. Marcus watched them, content to observe for the moment, and found himself thinking about the randomness of kindness. If Keisha had been on a different shift that first Tuesday, would this transformation have ever occurred? If she'd been too busy to notice Emma's attempts at signing, would Marcus still be locked in his pattern of distant neglect? The thought was terrifying. How many lives turned on such small moments? How many potential connections were missed because someone was too distracted, too busy, or simply didn't care enough to pay attention? His phone vibrated in his pocket, probably his assistant with some urgent matter that required his immediate attention. Once, he would have answered without hesitation, would have prioritized the business crisis over this moment in a cafe with his daughter and the woman who'd brought them together. Now, he didn't even check the message. Whatever it was could wait. The empire could survive without his constant micromanagement. Emma couldn't wait. She'd already waited 7 years for him to show up as her father. She deserved his full presence now. Keisha's break was drawing to a close, and she stood reluctantly, clearly not wanting to leave, but aware of her responsibilities. Same time next week? She asked, signing as she spoke. Every week, Marcus confirmed. For as long as you're willing to teach me. I'll always be willing, Keisha said softly. You're my best student. Both of you. After she left, Marcus and Emma lingered over their drinks. Emma worked on a drawing, something she'd taken up recently, sketching birds from memory onto paper placemats the cafe provided for children. Marcus watched her work, admiring her concentration, the careful way she rendered feathers and beaks and eyes. She had her mother's artistic talent, he realized. Another thing he'd never noticed before. Can I ask you something? Marcus signed, waiting for Emma to look up from her drawing. She nodded, setting down her crayon. Are you happy? Marcus asked, the signs feeling heavy with importance. Really happy? Not just today, but in general? Emma considered the question seriously, her small face thoughtful. Then, she signed, I'm happier now than before. But, I wish we'd started talking sooner. The honesty of her response hit Marcus squarely in the chest. She wasn't going to pretend that a month of attention erased 7 years of neglect. She was going to hold him accountable while also acknowledging his efforts to improve. It was more than he deserved, really. She could have rejected him entirely, could have decided his attempts were too little too late. Instead, she was giving him a chance. I wish we had too. Marcus signed back. I'm sorry I wasted so much time. Emma's expression softened. You're here now, she signed. That's what matters. Such grace from someone so young. Such willingness to forgive and move forward. Marcus wanted to deserve it. Wanted to be worthy of the second chance his daughter was offering him. He thought about the envelope he'd given Keisha, the resources he'd spent without a second thought. Money was easy for him to give. But time, attention, vulnerability, these were the currencies he'd hoarded his entire life. The things he'd been unwilling to spend on anyone, including his own child. What do you want to do today? Marcus asked. After this. Emma's face lit up. She'd grown to love this question, the open-ended invitation to direct their time together. Her hands moved quickly as she signed her answer, and Marcus had to ask her to slow down, still not quite fast enough to catch everything at full speed. The library, she signed more slowly. I want to show you my favorite section. And then, maybe the park if it stops raining. And then, home to read together. Simple pleasures. Age-appropriate activities. The kind of normal childhood experiences Marcus had been too important, too busy, too self-absorbed to provide before. Now they sounded like the best way to spend a Tuesday he could possibly imagine. They left the cafe hand in hand, Emma's small fingers wrapped trustingly in Marcus's larger ones. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city looked freshly washed, cleaner somehow. Marcus felt cleaner too, lighter, as if confessing his failures and committing to change had physically unburdened him. The library was a 20-minute walk, and Emma tugged him along familiar streets, clearly having made this journey before. With Maria, probably, or perhaps on her own, Marcus realized with a pang. His 7-year-old daughter knew her way through the city better than he did because he'd never taken the time to explore it with her. The children's section of the library was bright and welcoming, with low shelves arranged in colorful clusters and reading nooks with oversized pillows. Emma led Marcus to a specific section labeled Sign Language and Deaf Culture, and his breath caught. An entire shelf of books dedicated to the deaf and hard of hearing community, to sign language, to the culture and history of people who communicated the way his daughter did. How had he never known this existed? Emma pulled out book after book, showing him picture books about deaf characters, chapter books featuring deaf protagonists, nonfiction works about deaf history and culture. Some she'd clearly read multiple times, the pages worn soft with use. Others were new to her, books she'd noticed but hadn't checked out yet. Can we get these? She signed, indicating 5 books she'd selected. All of them, Marcus signed back. And more if you want. Emma's eyes widened. Then, she did something that surprised him. She signed, no. These 5 are enough. I can't read more than 5 before they're due back anyway. And someone else might want to read them too. We should share. 3 months after that first transformative Tuesday morning, Marcus stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom, practicing his speech for what must have been the 50th time. Except this wasn't a corporate presentation or a shareholder meeting. This was the launch event for the Wellington Foundation for Communication and Accessibility, and for the first time in his professional life, Marcus was genuinely nervous about public speaking. Emma sat on his bed behind him, watching with an expression somewhere between amusement and encouragement. She'd helped him write parts of the speech, insisting that certain points be included, certain perspectives be honored. Maria sat beside her, having been invited to attend the event as family, a designation that had made the nanny tear up when Marcus extended the invitation. You'll do great, Daddy. Emma signed, and Marcus caught the gesture in the mirror's reflection. He turned to face her, abandoning his practice. What if I mess up? He signed back. What if I say something wrong or offensive? I'm still learning about the deaf community. I don't want to speak over the very people I'm trying to help. Emma's expression turned serious, older than her 7 years. That's why Keisha helped write it, she signed. and Dr. Ramirez, and all the other people you asked. You listened to them. That's what matters. She was right, of course. Over the past 3 months, Marcus had assembled a diverse team of advisors for the foundation, including Keisha, who'd accepted his job offer and was now working part-time while finishing her degree, Dr. Sofia Ramirez, a deaf educator and activist who'd agreed to serve as the foundation's executive director, and a dozen other individuals from the deaf and hard of hearing community who'd been generous enough to educate him, challenge him, and help shape the foundation's mission. The event was being held at a downtown hotel, in a ballroom that had been specially equipped with ASL interpreters stationed around the room, live captions displayed on multiple screens, and seating arranged to ensure clear sight lines for signing. Marcus had hired an event coordinator who specialized in accessible events, and she'd transformed what could have been a standard charity launch into something truly inclusive. As Marcus's car pulled up to the hotel, he saw that the turnout exceeded his expectations. The parking lot was full, and people streamed into the building, a mix of business associates, community members, advocates, and families. He recognized several prominent figures from the deaf community, individuals whose articles and TED Talks he'd consumed voraciously over the past months. They'd actually come. They were giving him a chance. Emma held his hand tightly as they entered the building, Maria on her other side. His daughter looked beautiful in a deep purple dress she'd chosen herself, her hair styled in elegant braids threaded with silver ribbons. She'd insisted on being visible at the event, on standing with her father rather than sitting in the audience. People need to see that you have a deaf daughter, she'd signed when they discussed the arrangements. They need to know this is personal for you, not just business. The ballroom was already half full when they arrived, the energy electric with anticipation and, Marcus hoped, optimism. He spotted Keisha near the front, stunning in a professional navy suit, her hair straightened and pulled back in a sleek bun. She was speaking with Dr. Ramirez, a distinguished woman in her 50s whose presence commanded respect. When Keisha saw Marcus and Emma, her face lit up, and she signed a greeting that Emma returned enthusiastically. Nervous? Keisha asked when they reached her, signing and speaking simultaneously as she'd made her habit. Terrified, Marcus admitted. What if this is all a terrible mistake? What if I've completely misunderstood what the community needs? Dr. Ramirez, who'd been listening, placed a hand on his arm. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the distinct intonation patterns of someone who'd been deaf since birth but had learned to vocalize through years of speech therapy. Mr. Wellington, the fact that you're asking that question is exactly why this isn't a mistake. Too many hearing people assume they know what we need without ever asking us. You've spent 3 months listening, learning, adjusting your plans based on our feedback. That humility and willingness to be wrong is rare and valuable. Marcus felt some of his anxiety ease. Dr. Ramirez had that effect on people, a calm authority born from decades of advocacy and education. She'd been initially skeptical of Marcus's intentions when Keisha first approached her about the foundation, concerned that it would be another well-meaning but ultimately paternalistic charity run by hearing people for deaf people rather than with them. But as Marcus had demonstrated his commitment to genuine partnership, to centering deaf voices in all decisions, she'd become one of the foundation's strongest supporters. The event began with a performance by a deaf theater group, a stunning visual piece that combined signing, dance, and projected imagery to tell the story of language, connection, and community. Marcus watched, mesmerized, as the performers transformed the stage into a living canvas of communication. Emma sat transfixed beside him, her eyes wide with wonder. When the performance ended, the applause was thunderous, but Marcus noticed many people also raised their hands above their heads, fingers wiggling in the air. The deaf applause, he'd learned. Visual appreciation for visual art. Then, it was his turn to speak. Marcus walked to the podium with Emma by his side, just as they'd planned. The room fell silent, everyone's attention focused forward. He saw familiar faces in the crowd, business associates who'd questioned his sanity when he announced the foundation, friends who'd supported the idea without fully understanding it, and strangers who'd come because they cared about accessibility and inclusion. Marcus began signing as he spoke, his movements still slower and less fluid than native signers, but competent and sincere. Emma had insisted on this, that he demonstrate his commitment to sign language by using it himself rather than relying solely on interpreters. 3 months ago, I was a stranger to my own daughter, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I sat across from her every Tuesday morning in a cafe, and we existed in the same space without truly communicating. I spoke. She remained silent. I provided material comfort. She needed emotional connection. I hired experts to fix her. She needed a father who would learn her language. He paused, his hands forming the sign for language, a gesture that had become sacred to him over the past months. Then, a waitress named Keisha did something revolutionary. She spoke to my daughter in American Sign Language, and I watched Emma transform from a silent, withdrawn child into a vibrant, joyful, talkative person. Except she'd always been that person. I'd just been too blind, too arrogant, and too lazy to see it. The room was utterly still, everyone leaning forward slightly, engaged with his words. I could have learned sign language years ago. The resources were available. The teachers existed. I simply didn't consider it important enough to prioritize. I expected my deaf daughter to exist in my hearing world, to adapt to my preferences, to communicate on my terms. I never once considered that I should meet her in her world, that I should adapt, that I should learn her beautiful, expressive, complete language. Marcus looked down at Emma, who was watching him with pride evident in her small face. He signed, "I love you," to her before continuing. The Wellington Foundation for Communication and Accessibility exists because I'm not the only person who's made this mistake. All around us, barriers exist between people who could connect if only they had the tools, the education, and the willingness to bridge the gap. Deaf children in schools without adequate sign language resources. Businesses that fail to accommodate employees who communicate differently. Families struggling to understand each other across the divide of different languages and abilities. He gestured to the screens around the room, where the Foundation's mission statement was displayed in both English text and ASL video. This foundation will provide free sign language classes to families with deaf children. It will offer scholarships to students pursuing careers in accessibility, linguistics, and deaf education. It will work with businesses to create truly inclusive environments. It will support research into communication technologies and methods. And, most importantly, it will be run with guidance and leadership from the deaf and hard of hearing community, not for them, but with them. The applause started then, but Marcus raised his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. The room quieted again. I need to be clear about something. This foundation doesn't exist because I'm generous or particularly enlightened. It exists because I failed my daughter for 7 years, and I'm trying to ensure that other parents, other families, other institutions don't make the same mistakes I did. It exists because a waitress named Keisha had the compassion to speak to a lonely child in a cafe. It exists because my daughter had the patience to teach her father how to communicate when she had every right to give up on him. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through his careful composure. It exists because I've learned that the most important language we can speak is the language of the people we love, whatever form that language takes. This time when the applause came, Marcus let it wash over him. He saw people dabbing at their eyes, saw others raising their hands in the deaf applause. He saw his business associates looking at him with expressions of surprise and newfound respect. But, most importantly, he saw members of the deaf community nodding in approval, in acceptance, in recognition that perhaps, finally, someone with resources was actually listening. Dr. Ramirez took the podium next, and her speech outlined the Foundation's specific programs and initiatives. She spoke about the scholarship fund, already endowed with $5 million, that would support deaf students pursuing any field of study, not just disability-related careers. She described the family support program that would provide free ASL classes, counseling, and resources to hearing families with deaf children. She explained the business consultation service that would help companies create genuinely accessible environments rather than just meeting minimum legal requirements. Keisha spoke after Dr. Ramirez, sharing her own story of learning ASL in college, of seeing Emma struggling to communicate in the cafe, of the simple choice to use the language she'd learned. Her voice shook with emotion as she described watching Marcus and Emma's relationship transform, as she talked about the scholarship that had changed her life's trajectory. "I'm proof that this foundation's mission works," Keisha said, signing as she spoke. Marcus could have just thanked me and moved on. Instead, he asked me to help him understand not just sign language, but the entire culture and community he'd been ignorant about. He made himself vulnerable, admitted his mistakes, and committed to doing better. That's what we need more of, not perfection, but willingness to learn and change. Then came the portion of the event Marcus was most nervous about, the community panel. 5 individuals from the deaf and hard of hearing community, ranging in age from a 16-year-old deaf student to a 72-year-old deaf activist who'd fought for accessibility rights for decades, sat on stage to answer questions and share their perspectives. The teenage girl, whose name was Maya, spoke first. Through an interpreter, she described her frustration with a school system that treated sign language as a disability accommodation rather than a legitimate language. "I don't need to be fixed," she said, her signs sharp and emphatic. "I need people to respect my language and my culture. I need teachers who can communicate with me directly instead of through intermediaries. I need classmates who see me as complete, not broken." Her words struck Marcus deeply. How many times had he thought of Emma as broken? How many specialists had he hired to fix her mutism, never considering that maybe she didn't need fixing? Maybe she just needed understanding? An older man named Robert, deaf since age 5 after a childhood illness, talked about his career as an architect and the constant battles he'd faced in professional settings. "I'm good at my job," he said, "but I've lost opportunities because people assume I can't communicate effectively with clients. They assume I'll be a liability. Never mind that I design beautiful buildings. Never mind that I have 30 years of experience. They see the deafness first and the architect second." Marcus thought about his own company, about the hiring practices and assumptions that probably mirrored what Robert described. How many talented people had his organization overlooked because they communicated differently? How much human potential had been wasted because of rigid thinking about what normal communication looked like? The panel continued for an hour, each speaker sharing experiences of frustration and exclusion, but also moments of connection and community. They talked about the beauty of sign language, the richness of deaf culture, the strong bonds within the deaf community. They talked about the isolation many deaf children felt in hearing families that never learned to sign. They talked about the importance of representation, of seeing deaf characters in media, deaf people in leadership positions, deaf voices centered in conversations about accessibility. When the formal presentations ended, the event transitioned into a reception. Marcus found himself immediately surrounded by people wanting to speak with him, to thank him, to ask questions about the foundation's work. He tried to sign as much as possible, though he frequently needed to rely on interpreters for more complex conversations. Emma stayed close to his side, occasionally signing to correct his mistakes or help him understand something he'd missed. A deaf mother approached with her young son, perhaps 4 years old, who was enthusiastically signing about the cookies he'd just eaten. Through an interpreter, the woman said, "Thank you for doing this. My husband is hearing, and he's been resistant to learning ASL. He keeps saying our son needs to learn to speak, to fit into the hearing world. Maybe knowing there are successful hearing people who've made the effort to learn will convince him." Marcus knelt down to be at eye level with the little boy, who looked at him with curious eyes. He signed slowly, "What's your name?" The child's face lit up, and he signed back, spelling out Jonh. "That's a great name." Marcus signed, then finger-spelled Emma and pointed to his daughter. "This is Emma. She's deaf like you." Emma knelt down too, and the 2 children immediately launched into animated signing, Jonah telling Emma about the cookies, and Emma responding with equal enthusiasm about the dessert table she'd spotted. The ease of their communication, the instant connection, reinforced everything Marcus had learned about language and belonging. When you could truly communicate, barriers dissolved. "Tell your husband something for me," Marcus said to Jonah's mother. "Tell him that learning ASL was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done. Harder than building a billion-dollar company. Harder than any business negotiation or deal. But it gave me my daughter back. It gave me access to this whole person I'd been missing. If he wants to truly know his son, if he wants to be part of his world rather than forcing his son to only exist in the hearing world, learning ASL isn't optional. It's essential. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded vigorously. I'll tell him. Thank you. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Parents seeking advice, deaf adults sharing their stories, educators asking about the foundation's school programs, business leaders inquiring about accessibility consultation. Each interaction reinforced for Marcus that the foundation was addressing a genuine need, filling gaps that existed throughout society. Keisha found him during a brief, quiet moment, when Emma had gone with Maria to get more food. You did it, she said, her smile radiant. You actually did it. We did it, Marcus corrected. None of this happens without you, Keisha. Without that first Tuesday morning when you chose to sign with a lonely child. I've been thinking about that day a lot, Keisha admitted. I almost didn't do it. I was busy, the cafe was crowded, and I thought maybe I was misreading Emma's attempts to sign. I almost just took your order and moved on. It's scary how close we came to none of this happening. Marcus felt a chill at the thought. What if Keisha had been too busy that day? What if she'd ignored Emma's signing? Would he still be sitting in that cafe every Tuesday, a stranger to his own daughter, perpetually blind to what he was missing? The randomness of transformation, the thin line between connection and continued isolation, was terrifying to contemplate. But you didn't move on, Marcus said firmly. You chose kindness. You chose to see Emma. And that changed everything. Dr. Ramirez joined them, holding a glass of wine and looking satisfied with how the evening had gone. The community response has been overwhelmingly positive, she reported. I've had at least a dozen people ask about getting involved, either as volunteers or advisors. And 3 different organizations have approached me about partnerships. That's wonderful, Marcus said, feeling the foundation solidify from an idea into a real, sustainable entity. There's something else, Dr. Ramirez continued, her expression turning more serious. Maya, the teenage girl from the panel? She asked if she could talk to Emma. She said she's never met another deaf child from a wealthy family who had hearing parents. She said she feels isolated in her private school, like she's the only one navigating between 2 worlds. I think she's looking for connection, for someone who understands. Marcus looked over at Emma, who was laughing at something Maria had signed. His daughter had found her community in sign language classes and events like this, but what about her daily life? Her expensive private school had exactly 2 deaf students, Emma and one other boy in the upper grades whom she rarely saw. Her neighborhood had no other deaf children that Marcus knew of. She existed primarily in the hearing world, translating herself, explaining herself, constantly bridging the gap. I'd like Emma to meet Maya, Marcus said decisively. And I'd like to create a program through the foundation specifically for deaf children, a place where they can just be themselves without having to translate or explain. Summer camps, weekend programs, social events. Somewhere they're the majority, not the minority. Dr. Ramirez's smile was approving. Now you're thinking like an advocate, not just a philanthropist. This is good, Marcus. This is exactly the kind of evolution we need. 1 year after that first transformative Tuesday morning, Marcus sat in the same cafe at the same table, but everything else had changed. The cafe itself had undergone a transformation, now proudly displaying a sign in the window. ASL friendly, staff trained in American Sign Language. The owner, inspired by the Wellington Foundation's work, had paid for all employees to take basic sign language courses. Keisha, now the Foundation's Director of Education and Community Outreach, still worked weekend shifts at the cafe, claiming she couldn't give up the place where it all started. Emma sat across from Marcus, but she wasn't the only child at the table today. Beside her sat Maya, the 16-year-old from the Foundation's launch event, who'd become something like a big sister to Emma over the past year. And next to Maya was Jonah, now 5 years old, whose hearing father had indeed learned sign language and become one of the Foundation's most vocal advocates. 3 deaf children, 3 generations of what was possible when barriers came down and communication opened up. The 4 of them were planning the Foundation's first summer camp, set to launch in 2 months. Well, the children were planning it while Marcus took notes and tried to keep up with their rapid-fire signing. His skills had improved dramatically over the year, but These three together created a whirlwind of visual communication that sometimes left him scrambling. "We need a climbing wall," Maya signed emphatically. "And not some baby wall. A real one, like 30 feet high." "And horses," Emma added. "The camp has to have horses. I've wanted to ride a horse forever." Jonah, not to be outdone, signed swimming pool, Olympic size, and diving boards. "The high ones." Marcus laughed, struggling to keep up with translating their demands into his notes. "So what you're telling me is you want a camp that costs about $10 million. All three children nodded seriously, then collapsed into giggles when they saw his expression. "Okay, realistic requests," Marcus signed, trying to look stern but failing as Emma made a face at him. "What do you actually need to have a great camp experience?" Maya's expression turned thoughtful, more serious. "We need counselors who can sign," she said. "Not interpreters, actual counselors who are deaf or fluent in ASL. Every other camp I've been to, there's always this gap between me and the staff. They're nice, but they don't really get it. I want counselors who understand what it's like to be us." Emma nodded vigorously in agreement. "And other kids like us. Lots of them. I want to be somewhere where I'm not explaining things all the time, where everyone just gets it." Jonah, the youngest, added simply, "I want friends who talk like me." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, something that happened more frequently these days. A year ago, he wouldn't have understood the depth of what these children were expressing. The isolation of being different, of constantly translating yourself, of never quite belonging fully in any space. Now he understood it viscerally, had witnessed it in Emma's experiences, had heard countless stories from families who'd come to the foundation seeking support. "Friends who talk like you," Marcus repeated, signing carefully. "Yes, that's exactly what this camp will be." Keisha appeared then, carrying a tray laden with drinks and pastries. She'd timed her break perfectly, as always, to coincide with their Tuesday morning gathering. This tradition had persisted throughout the year, evolving from just Marcus and Emma to include an ever-expanding circle of people connected by the Foundation's work. "Planning session going well?" Keisha asked, signing and speaking simultaneously as she set down the tray. "They want horses and Olympic pools and climbing walls," Marcus reported with mock despair. "Apparently I've been too successful at teaching them to dream big." "You have been," Keisha agreed, grinning. "But, seriously, the camp is moving forward? We've secured the location?" Marcus nodded. "The old camp Whispering Pines agreed to our terms. We have exclusive use for 8 weeks this summer, with an option to purchase the property outright if the program succeeds. Dr. Ramirez is interviewing counselors, and we've already received over 200 applications from families wanting to send their children." 200. Maya's eyes widened. "That's amazing." "It's necessary," Marcus corrected gently. "There are thousands of deaf children in this region alone who've never had access to a camp where they can just be themselves. 200 is a start, but it's nowhere near enough." The conversation shifted to logistics, cabin assignments, activity schedules, dietary restrictions, medical protocols. Maya, despite being only 16, had practical insights from her years of attending various camps as the token deaf kid. Emma contributed ideas about arts and crafts activities, nature exploration, and, of course, the horses she desperately wanted to ride. Jonah mostly listened, occasionally signing questions or suggestions in his still-developing language skills. Watching them, Marcus marveled at how natural this all felt now. A year ago, sitting at a table conducting business in sign language while surrounded by deaf children would have been unimaginable. Now it was simply Tuesday morning. His life had reorganized itself around this new reality, and he couldn't imagine going back to his old existence. His business empire had noticed the shift. Some associates worried he'd lost focus, that his commitment to the foundation was diluting his attention to his companies. They weren't entirely wrong. Marcus had delegated more, stepped back from daily operations, trusted his executive team to handle what he once insisted on controlling personally. Surprisingly, the companies hadn't collapsed. If anything, they'd become more innovative, more dynamic, freed from his micromanagement. And he'd implemented changes throughout his corporate structure based on what he'd learned about accessibility. Every office now had ASL-fluent staff. Job postings were designed to welcome applicants who communicated differently. Meeting spaces were equipped with real-time captioning. The employee handbook had been completely rewritten to ensure inclusive language and policies. Some executives had resisted, arguing it was expensive and unnecessary. Marcus had been blunt in response: adapt or leave. This was the new standard, not negotiable. 3 employees had quit over the changes. 47 deaf and hard of hearing individuals had been hired in the past year across various positions and levels. The financial cost had been significant, but manageable. The cultural shift had been revolutionary. Earth to Marcus, Keisha signed, waving her hand in front of his face. You zoned out. Everything okay? Marcus smiled, returning his attention to the group. Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I didn't know any of you. Emma and I barely spoke to each other. I thought success meant money and power and control. Now I'm sitting here planning a summer camp for deaf kids and realizing this is the most important work I've ever done. Emma reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Her other hand signed, I'm proud of you, Daddy. For words. Such simple words. But, coming from his daughter, they meant everything. More than any business award, any financial milestone, any recognition from his corporate peers. Emma was proud of him. He'd become someone worth her pride. Maya's phone buzzed, and she checked it quickly before signing. My mom's here to pick me up. I have a calc test tomorrow I need to study for. She rolled her eyes dramatically at the mention of calculus, making Emma giggle. As Maya gathered her things, she paused and looked at Marcus seriously. Thank you, she signed. For the foundation, for the camp, for actually listening to us instead of just deciding what we need. You're one of the good ones. From a 16-year-old who'd probably encountered countless well-meaning but ultimately condescending adults, this was high praise. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. He had power, resources, and influence. How he used those things mattered. The deaf community was trusting him to use them wisely, to center their voices, to create change that actually helped rather than reinforcing existing barriers. Jonah left soon after, his father arriving to collect him. The man, whose name was David, had become a friend to Marcus over the past year. They'd bonded over their shared experience of being hearing fathers learning to navigate their deaf children's world. David worked in construction and had started his own initiative, teaching basic ASL to his crews so they could work safely with deaf employees. Small ripples spreading outward from that first moment in the cafe. When only Marcus, Emma, and Keisha remained, the conversation turned more personal. Keisha was graduating next month with her linguistics degree, and she'd been accepted into a doctoral program at a prestigious university. The foundation had offered to fund her graduate studies while she continued her work with them part-time. I can't believe this is my life now, Keisha said, shaking her head in wonder. A year ago, I was serving coffee and struggling to pay tuition. Now I'm starting a PhD program, working for a foundation I helped create, and I get to make actual change in the world. It's surreal. You earned all of it, Marcus said firmly. Your compassion, your knowledge, your willingness to help. Those aren't accidents or luck. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. Everything that followed came from that choice. It was such a small thing, though, Keisha protested. I just signed with a kid. Small things become big things. Emma signed, her expression wise beyond her years. You talking to me became Daddy learning sign language, which became the foundation, which is becoming the camp, which will help hundreds of kids. Small things matter. Keisha's eyes grew misty, and she reached over to hug Emma. When did you get so philosophical? Emma grinned. I've always been this smart. You just couldn't understand me before. The joke landed with gentle humor, but it carried truth too. How many brilliant thoughts had Emma had over the years that Marcus never heard because he couldn't speak her language? How many insights, questions, observations had been lost in the silence between them? The thought was painful, but Marcus had learned not to dwell in guilt. Forward motion mattered more than backward regret. Their Tuesday morning gathering began to wind down. Keisha had to return to work, and Marcus had a foundation board meeting later that afternoon. But before they left, Emma pulled something from her backpack, a folded piece of paper that she handed to Marcus with a shy smile. He unfolded it carefully and found himself looking at a drawing, rendered in Emma's increasingly skilled hand. It showed the cafe, recognizable by the chalkboard menu and the specific arrangement of tables. In the drawing, a man and a small girl sat at one table, the girl's hands frozen in mid-sign. Standing beside the table was a woman, also signing, her face wearing a kind smile. Above the scene, Emma had written in careful letters, "The day everything changed." Marcus studied the drawing, noting the details Emma had included. The chocolate muffin on the table, the coffee cup in his hand, the books on a nearby chair. She'd captured the moment Keisha first signed to her, had preserved it in visual form, had declared it important enough to memorialize. "This is beautiful," Marcus signed, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. "Can I keep it?" Emma nodded, pleased by his reaction. "I made it for you. For your office. So you remember." "I could never forget," Marcus signed back. "But I'll hang it in my office anyway. Right where I can see it every day." He meant it. The drawing would go on the wall behind his desk, replacing the abstract art piece that currently hung there. Every time he looked up from his work, he'd see this moment, this transforming instant when a stranger's kindness had cracked open his carefully controlled world and let love pour in. They left the cafe together, walking out into a bright spring morning. The city had woken fully, traffic flowing, people hurrying to their destinations, life continuing its relentless forward momentum. But Marcus moved more slowly now, more deliberately. He wasn't racing to the next meeting or the next deal. He was walking with his daughter, holding her hand, fully present in this moment. Emma started signing about her upcoming birthday party, animated as she described the theme she wanted, birds of paradise. Marcus listened, asked questions, made suggestions, fully engaged in the planning. 8 years old. His daughter was turning 8 in 2 weeks, and this year he knew exactly what she wanted, exactly who she was. Not because Maria had told him, not because he'd guessed based on generic assumptions about children her age, but because Emma had told him herself, in her language, in conversations they'd built together. The foundation offices occupied the top floor of one of Marcus's downtown buildings, a space he'd renovated specifically for accessibility. Wide hallways accommodated wheelchairs. Lighting was designed to facilitate lip reading and signing. Conference rooms had soundproofing and acoustics optimized for both spoken language and sign language conversations. Every design choice had been made in consultation with the disability community, and the result was a space that felt welcoming to everyone. Dr. Ramirez was already there when Marcus and Emma arrived, along with several other board members. The board had grown over the year to include educators, activists, parents, and deaf community leaders. Marcus chaired the meetings, but didn't dominate them. He'd learned to listen more than he spoke, to facilitate rather than dictate, to recognize that his wealth and business experience didn't make him the authority on accessibility issues. "Before we start the official meeting," Dr. Ramirez said, "I want to share something. Remember the family support program we launched 6 months ago? The one providing free ASL classes to hearing families with deaf children." Everyone nodded. It was one of the Foundation's cornerstone initiatives, addressing the fact that 90% of deaf children were born to hearing parents who typically didn't know sign language. "We just enrolled our 500th family," Dr. Ramirez continued, her voice thick with emotion. 500 families who are learning to communicate with their own children. 500 deaf children who will grow up in homes where they're understood. Do you realize how revolutionary that is? The room erupted in applause, hands waving in the air in the deaf applause that Marcus had come to love for its visual energy. Emma bounced in her seat excitedly, signing rapid-fire questions to Dr. Ramirez about the families, where they were located, how old the children were. Marcus felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but also humility. 500 families. That was 500 stories like his, 500 parents learning what he'd learned, 500 children being seen and understood. But there were thousands more families who needed this support, thousands more children being raised in homes where they couldn't fully communicate. The meeting progressed through various agenda items. Financial reports showed the foundation was sustainable, with Marcus's initial endowment generating enough interest to fund ongoing operations even before accounting for the steady stream of additional donations they'd begun receiving. Program updates detailed successes and challenges across all their initiatives. The scholarship fund had supported 37 students in its first year. The business consultation service had worked with over 100 companies. The educational advocacy program had helped families navigate school systems and fight for appropriate accommodations for their deaf children. But the most exciting agenda item was the camp. Dr. Ramirez presented the final plans, incorporating feedback from deaf community members, child development experts, and the children themselves. The 8-week program would serve 200 campers in 4 two-week sessions. Activities ranged from traditional camp offerings like swimming and hiking to specialized workshops in deaf culture, ASL poetry and storytelling, and deaf history. Most importantly, the camp would be led primarily by deaf staff, providing campers with deaf role models and mentors. "We're calling it Camp Visible Voices," Dr. Ramirez announced, displaying the logo on the screen. A place where deaf children's voices, expressed through sign, are not just heard but celebrated. The name was perfect, Marcus thought. Visible voices. That's exactly what sign language was. Thoughts and feelings made visible through movement and expression. And these children deserved a place where their voices were the norm, where they didn't have to translate themselves, where they could just be. One board member, a deaf educator named Marcus, had come to deeply respect, raised a concern. What about siblings? Many of our campers have hearing siblings. Are we creating an experience that excludes them, or can we find a way to include family members? It was a thoughtful question, the kind that made Marcus grateful for the diverse perspectives on the board. The discussion that followed was rich and nuanced, weighing inclusion against the importance of creating a space specifically for deaf children. Eventually, they decided to offer a shorter family week at the end of summer, where deaf campers could invite siblings and parents to experience the camp together. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end, Marcus felt mentally exhausted but energized. This was work that mattered. These decisions would impact real children's lives, would create opportunities that hadn't existed before, would tear down barriers that had stood for generations. As board members filed out, Dr. Ramirez approached Marcus. "Walk with me," she asked, signing the question. They walked to the large windows overlooking the city, Emma staying behind to play a video game with one of the deaf board members' children. Dr. Ramirez was quiet for a moment, just gazing out at the urban landscape below. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, she finally said, her hands moving expressively as she signed and spoke. "Fighting for accessibility, advocating for the deaf community, trying to change hearts and minds. It's exhausting work, and progress is usually incremental. Small victories measured over decades." Marcus nodded, sensing she had more to say. "Then, you come along," Dr. Ramirez continued, "and in 1 year, you create change I've been fighting for my entire career. A fully funded foundation with multiple major programs. A summer camp designed by and for the deaf community. Corporate accessibility initiatives that actually have teeth. It's remarkable, and I'm grateful for it. But it also makes me angry." Marcus was taken aback. Angry. Dr. Ramirez turned to face him directly. Angry that it took a wealthy white man deciding this mattered before real resources flowed to these issues. Angry that I've been saying these same things for decades, but when you say them, suddenly, people listen. Angry at the systems that make it so hard for grassroots activists to create change, but so easy for billionaires to swoop in and fund solutions. The honesty was brutal, and Marcus felt it like a punch. But Dr. Ramirez wasn't finished. "That said," she continued, her expression softening slightly, "you're using your privilege well. You're listening to the community instead of imposing your ideas. You're sharing power instead of hoarding it. You're willing to be corrected, to learn, to admit when you're wrong. That's rare and valuable. So I'm angry at the system, but I'm grateful for you." Both things are true. Marcus took a moment to process her words, the complexity of her perspective. She was right, of course. It was unjust that his wealth and status gave him access and influence that dedicated activists couldn't achieve through years of work. It was wrong that society listened to him simply because he was who he was, not because his ideas were better or more important. "Thank you for being honest with me," Marcus said finally. "And you're right to be angry. The system is unjust. I can't fix that single-handedly, but I can acknowledge it, and Try to use my unearned advantages to create space for voices that should have been heard all along. That's what I'm trying to do with the foundation. Not speak for the deaf community, but amplify their voices, provide resources they should have always had access to. Dr. Ramirez nodded slowly. Keep doing that. Keep checking your ego at the door. Keep listening more than you speak. Keep sharing credit and power. If you can do that, this foundation will be truly revolutionary. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma, who came running over with the other child, both of them signing excitedly about the video game they'd been playing. Marcus watched his daughter, fully alive and engaged, and thought about Dr. Ramirez's words. Emma would grow up in a different world than the one he'd known. A world where her deafness wasn't treated as a deficit, where sign language was recognized as a complete, legitimate language, where accommodations were standard rather than exceptions. He couldn't take full credit for creating that world. Advocates like Dr. Ramirez had been building it for decades. But he could contribute to it, could accelerate its arrival, could use his resources to tear down barriers faster. Not for recognition or redemption, but because it was right. Because Emma and Maya and Jonah and 500 other children deserved it. Because the world was better when everyone could be fully themselves, when communication was possible across differences, when understanding triumphed over assumption. That evening, back at the penthouse, Marcus found Emma in her room, surrounded by the books they'd collected over the past year. Her shelves now overflowed with stories featuring deaf characters, books about sign language and deaf culture, biographies of deaf activists and artists. She was reading one of her favorites, a graphic novel about a deaf superhero whose power came from her ability to communicate in multiple languages. Marcus knocked on her doorframe to get her attention, and she looked up with a smile. "Can I come in?" he signed. Emma nodded, patting the spot next to her on the bed. Marcus sat, and together they looked at the book she was reading. "Do you ever wish you could hear?" Marcus signed the question carefully, worried about her answer, but needing to know. Emma considered the question seriously, her small face thoughtful. Then, she signed, "Sometimes, maybe. Like when birds sing, I wonder what that sounds like. Or music. I see people's faces when they listen to music, and they look happy, and I wonder what that feels like." Marcus felt his heart ache for what his daughter couldn't experience. But Emma wasn't finished. "But, mostly, no," she continued signing. "Because being deaf is just who I am. It's not good or bad, it just is. Like having green eyes or brown hair. It's part of me. And I like me." The simple confidence in those last words, "I like me," hit Marcus with overwhelming force. His daughter liked herself. Fully and completely, not despite her deafness, but including it as a fundamental part of who she was. When had he learned to like himself? Had he ever reached that place of self-acceptance? He'd spent his entire life proving himself, achieving, conquering, never stopping long enough to simply be content with who he was. "I like you too," Marcus signed, his movements gentle. "I like everything about you. Your kindness, your humor, your intelligence, your determination. And, yes, the fact that you're deaf, because it's part of what makes you uniquely you." Emma launched herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. Over her shoulder, Marcus could see her drawing of the cafe hanging on her wall, a visual reminder of where their journey together had truly begun. Not when Emma was born, though that's when it should have started. But 1 year ago, when a compassionate waitress had taken the time to speak a child's language and, in doing so, had shown a blind father how to finally see his daughter. The ripples from that moment continued spreading outward. 500 families learning to communicate. 200 children about to experience a summer camp where they belonged completely. 37 students pursuing their dreams with financial support. Over 100 companies creating more accessible workplaces. And at the center of it all, one father and daughter who'd found their way back to each other across the silence that had separated them. Marcus held Emma close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and made a silent promise. He would keep learning, keep growing, keep breaking down barriers. Not just for Emma, but for all the children like her, all the families struggling to connect, all the people whose voices weren't being heard simply because they spoke a different language. This was his life's work now, more important than any business deal, more meaningful than any amount of money. And It had all started with one simple act of kindness in a cafe on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes the most revolutionary changes begin with the smallest gestures. Sometimes the most powerful language is the one you learn for love. The evening wound down around 11, much later than Marcus had initially planned. Emma was exhausted, practically asleep on Maria's shoulder as they made their way to the car. But she'd had a wonderful time, Marcus could tell. She'd spent the evening surrounded by people who spoke her language, who understood her world, who saw her as complete rather than lacking. That experience alone made the entire event worthwhile. As they drove home through the quiet city streets, Maria in the front seat and Emma drowsing in the back, Marcus thought about the journey of the past 3 months. From that first Tuesday morning when Keisha had signed to Emma, through the intense period of learning and practice to tonight's launch event, everything had led to this moment. He'd built a foundation not just with money but with genuine commitment to change, to learning, to becoming better. His phone buzzed with messages, probably congratulations from people who'd attended the event, but Marcus didn't check it. He just watched Emma's sleeping face in the rearview mirror, this magnificent child he'd almost lost to his own blindness. She stirred slightly, her hands moving in her sleep, forming signs even in her dreams, communicating in the language that was most natural to her, most authentically hers. Marcus made a silent promise to himself and to Emma. The foundation would grow, would help thousands of people, would create real change in how society approached communication and accessibility. But it would never become more important than the reason it existed in the first place. One father learning to truly see, hear, and understand his daughter. Marcus felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. His daughter understood sharing, understood community resources, understood that her wants didn't supersede others' needs. She'd learned these lessons despite his example, not because of it. Wherever she'd developed her sense of fairness and consideration, it hadn't come from watching him hoard wealth and resources. They checked out the 5 books, and Emma insisted on carrying them herself in the library's tote bag. As they walked to the park, Marcus found himself looking at the world differently. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: a sign language interpreter at a bus stop, helping a deaf woman understand the bus schedule, a closed caption display in a store window, a child signing to their parent outside a restaurant. The deaf and hard of hearing community had always been there, moving through the world parallel to him. But he'd never noticed. He'd been blind to an entire dimension of human experience. The park was nearly empty, the rain having kept most people indoors. Emma found a covered pavilion where they could sit and read without getting wet, and they spent the next hour going through one of her library books together. It was a picture book about a deaf girl who taught her classmates sign language so she could play with them at recess. The parallels to Emma's own life were obvious, and Marcus wondered if she saw herself in the character, hoped that someday her classmates might learn to communicate with her the way her father finally had. When Emma started to look tired, they walked back to where Marcus had parked his car. The drive home was quiet, but comfortable, Emma looking out the window at the rain-soaked city while Marcus navigated the familiar streets. He thought about the day, about Keisha's tears, about the scholarship he'd given her, and the job he'd offered. He thought about the library full of books he'd never known existed, about the community of deaf and hard of hearing people he'd never acknowledged. He thought about his daughter beside him, content and tired, having spent a perfect, ordinary Tuesday with her father. Back at the penthouse, Emma headed straight to her room to put away her new library books. Marcus went to his office, intending to finally check his messages, but found himself opening his laptop to a different page instead. He searched for organizations supporting deaf children, for scholarships and programs and initiatives. If he could make one waitress's life easier, why not expand that impact? Why not use his resources to create opportunities for more people like Emma, more families struggling to communicate across the barrier of different languages? By the time Maria returned that evening, Marcus had drafted a proposal for a new charitable foundation focused on accessibility, communication, and supporting deaf and hard of hearing individuals. It would require significant capital, ongoing operational funding, and dedicated staff. It would be complex and challenging and would likely never turn a profit. In short, It would be everything his usual business ventures weren't. And it would be the most important thing he'd ever done. Went back to work, Emma signed something that made him pause. This is the best week ever. Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing all the time they'd lost, and all the potential they'd almost squandered. For me too, he signed back. And it doesn't have to end. I'm going to be better, Emma. I promise. Not perfect, but better. Emma nodded, accepting his promise, and then asked a question that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Can we go back to the cafe Tuesday? I want to show Keisha my new books. Of course, Marcus thought. Keisha, the woman who'd started all of this, who'd seen a child struggling to communicate, and taken the time to speak her language. He'd been so focused on his own journey, his own learning, that he hadn't properly thanked her, had barely even acknowledged the magnitude of what she'd done. Yes, Marcus signed. And I think I need to thank Keisha properly. She changed everything. Emma considered this, her head tilted thoughtfully, then signed. She didn't change everything. She just helped you see what was already there. The wisdom in those words, coming from a 7-year-old, struck Marcus profoundly. Emma was right. She'd always been there, fully formed and complete, waiting for him to notice, to care enough to learn her language. Keisha hadn't created anything new. She'd simply helped Marcus see what he'd been missing all along. The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any business setback ever had. That's all she wants. Not money, not expensive toys, not the best schools or the most qualified therapists. Just effort. Just the willingness to try to meet her in her world instead of demanding she somehow find a way into his. It was such a small ask, such a reasonable request, and yet he'd failed to provide it for 7 years. Marcus reached across the table, slowly, giving Emma time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. His large hand covered her small one, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the delicate bones of her fingers, the realness of her that he'd somehow managed to keep at arm's length for so long. I promise I'll try, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll try every single day, and I won't give up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Emma squeezed his hand, and it was such a simple gesture, such a basic human connection, but it felt revolutionary. Father and daughter, touching without the barrier of obligation or routine, actually reaching for each other across the divide that had separated them for so long. Keisha stood, clearly emotional herself. I should get back to work, but I'll see you both tomorrow? Same time. Marcus nodded, already knowing that tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. As Keisha walked away to attend to other customers, he remained holding Emma's hand, neither of them moving. The cafe bustled around them, life continuing its normal rhythm. But, at their small table, something had fundamentally shifted. The impossible had happened. A wall had started to crack. And for the first time since Catherine's death, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he'd thought was lost forever: hope.